In this lecture, we are going to move on to another package called PostCSS. Sass is a dominant language in the development world for extending CSS. As the years go by, it's starting to lose popularity. Another package was introduced called PostCSS. It takes an entirely different approach from Sass. You can use PostCSS over Sass, or a combination of both. Before getting into PostCSS, let's talk about how Sass works. Sass is a preprocessor language because it's a language that gets compiled into CSS. It's because browsers don't understand Sass code. There are dozens of preprocessor languages available, like less or stylus. In the end, they all get compiled to CSS. PostCSS takes a different approach. It is not a language. There is no special file extension. Instead, it's a library written in JavaScript. It'll convert your CSS into an object. The object it generates can be manipulated and transformed with JavaScript. Once you've made your changes, the object will be compiled into CSS. The advantage here is that we can use JavaScript to interact with our CSS code. This is why it's called PostCSS. It is a library that can modify your CSS code after you've written it. PostCSS is popular within the Vite and Vue community. Unlike Sass, we do not need to install the PostCSS package, nor do we need to configure this package. It's installed and configured by Vite. This feature gets activated by creating a specific file in our project. In the root directory of our project, create a file called postcss.config.js. PostCSS will search for this file. If it finds this file, it'll load the configuration settings. Inside this file, we must export an object. The object will contain our configuration settings. There are several things we can do, but we'll keep it simple. By default, PostCSS does not apply changes to your CSS. You must install plugins for manipulating the output of your CSS. There are two options at our disposal. Firstly, we can install plugins from third-party developers. Secondly, we can develop custom plugins. For this demonstration, we are going to use a third-party plugin. Vendor prefixes are an important feature of CSS. They allow us to use experimental features in our CSS. However, we may forget to use a vendor prefix. There's a plugin for automatically applying vendor prefixes to your CSS code. There's a vast repository of plugins available. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a site called PostCSS Parts. This site provides a list of plugins from the community. I highly recommend bookmarking it if you plan on using PostCSS in future projects. Let's switch back to the editor. Inside the command line, input the following command: npm install autoprefixer save-dev. This module is a plugin for PostCSS. It'll scan our CSS properties for missing vendors. It'll add vendor prefixes to properties that require a vendor prefix for older browsers. After installing this plugin, we must load it from within the configuration file. In the configuration file for PostCSS, we'll add a property called plugins. Its value will be an array. Inside this array, we can load a plugin by calling the require function. This function accepts the name of the package to load. Let's pass in autoprefixer. Great! The plugin should get loaded into our workflow. To test our code, let's update our CSS. Open the style.scss code. PostCSS does not work with Sass. Luckily, Vite will process Sass first. After the Sass file has been compiled into CSS, the CSS will be passed on to PostCSS. It's perfectly fine to continue using Sass. Alternatively, you can switch back to CSS and remove Sass from your workflow. Either option is at your disposal. Inside this file, let's add a selector called : placeholder. Next, change the color property to red. The placeholder selector will allow us to manipulate the properties of an input's placeholder. Developers will add this selector to change the color of the element. This selector has a prefix for Firefox. What if we forget to add the prefix for this browser? No problem. The Auto Prefixer plugin will add it for us. Let's save our file. Next, we may need to restart the server. Otherwise, the plugin may not be applied to our project. In the command line, restart the npm run dev command. So far, we shouldn't receive errors. Let's view the application in the browser. Nothing has changed. In the Developer Tools, open the Elements panel. Search for the Style tag in the Head section of the document. The placeholder selector was duplicated. The second copy of this selector has the Mozilla prefixer applied to it. That's great. We never have to worry about forgetting to add a prefix to our CSS. In addition, we can purposely leave out prefixes from the original codebase. It'll keep our code clean. PostCSS can handle adding the prefixes during compilation. That's all there is to PostCSS. It's a tool you can configure with plugins to transform the output of your CSS.